Hello, I'm Mariana Siciliano, and I'm an educator in public programs and creative practice at the Met. I'm delighted to welcome you to our series Insider Insights, which offers a closer look at objects across the Met's collection and special exhibitions with museum experts. Today's program is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Making the Met, 1870 through 2020, on view until January 3rd. The exhibition commemorates the museum's 150th anniversary and tells a story of the institution's development through 10 transformative moments. Included in these moments are the years around 1929, which marked a turning point for the museum's engagement with modern art, an area which the museum approached with apprehension. Defining acquisitions were made and other opportunities not taken, which shaped the Met's collection for decades to come. Providing a closer look at this period is Laura Corey, Senior Research Associate, European Paintings and the Director's Office, Randall Griffey, Curator in Modern and Contemporary Art, and Doug Eklund, Curator in the Department of Photographs. They will each share key objects and past exhibitions central to telling this story. To get started, I'll hand things over to Laura, who co-organized the exhibition with Andrea Bayer, to begin our program today.
Thank you, Mariana. We're delighted to be here with you all virtually today and to give you some insight into Making the Met 1870 to 2020. So before we dive into this moment around 1929, that pivotal year in the United States that saw the fall of the stock market that incited the Great Depression, I'm going to take you through a little bit of the earlier sections of the exhibition to give you some context. So we begin here in the introductory gallery of the exhibition, where you see 7 works of art from around the world and across time, all masterpieces that connect to the human figure. Because at the core of this exhibition is the idea that the Metropolitan Museum of Art connects art with the public, and that there are people who are the ones to start off these moments of transformation in the Met's history. Each of the 10 galleries connects off of a central axis called the street that gives insight into the past through images of visitors, as well as behind the scenes views all the way through the museum's history, and even culminates in a view over Central Park. The first gallery and our first transformative moment, the founding decades, takes us all the way back to 1870, when the Met is founded without a collection and builds one from scratch. At first, with global aspirations, but primarily acquiring art that had been sanctioned by other museums, such as examples seen in Europe, like the Louvre and the Prado, with old master paintings and antiquities of the biblical lands among the priorities, but also early acquisitions that represented other interests of New York collectors and began to bring diversity and that global scope to the collection. The next 2 galleries that focus on the early years of the 20th century look at parallel tracks between the museum's emphasis on its educational mission in a section called Art for All, and a section called Princely Aspirations, about those Gilded Age tycoons who elevated the ambitions of the museum, collecting great works of art of rarity, quality, and often distinguished provenance. In the following 2 sections of the exhibition, we consider excavation as an important way of building the collections of antiquities, and creating a national narrative looks at building up the collections of American art to form a national collection, leading up to the opening of the American Wing in 1924. And that brings us to 1929. We have a gallery called Visions of Collecting that primarily focuses on the transformative bequest of Louisine and Henry Osborne Havemeyer in 1929, a gift of 1,967 objects that enhanced nearly every collection at the museum, and was especially known for its collection of Impressionism. Of those nearly 2,000 objects, 200 were works of 19th century French art in almost every medium. And that is what is especially new about this gift. So prior to 1929, to give some sense of where we were in this moment, Impressionism, which had been a kind of avant-garde art of the time when the Met was founded in the 1870s, had very little presence in the galleries. Before the Havemeyer bequest, for example, the museum had only one work by Claude Monet, one finished pastel by Edgar Degas, one painting by Paul Cézanne. And the Havemeyer gift enhanced this with hundreds of examples all together. So we see here a view into the galleries where you can start to get a sense of some of this range as it is presented in Making the Met. In this slide, you see works by Mary Cassatt, the very important advisor to the Havemeyers, who introduced them to Impressionism in the 1870s. Works by Degas is sculpture, pastel, paintings, drawings, and even a glimpse at a Japanese print. Here you'll see Louisine and Henry Havemeyer themselves as they were pictured in 1889 on a visit to Paris, which kicked off much of their large-scale collecting of Impressionism. And next to this, you see an image from the 1930 exhibition that revealed the Havemeyer collection in full force to the New York public. So Louisine Havemeyer dies in 1929 in January, and her bequest is announced shortly thereafter, considered one of the most magnificent gifts by any individual in the history of the Metropolitan Museum by then director Edward Robinson. So this moment takes place prior to the stock market crash in October, but the exhibition debuts in March of 1930, so not long after. And criticism of the exhibition was very enthusiastic about the quality, the range of objects in the Havemeyer collection, and a generally celebratory tone in this moment of darker times in the world around. So here you can see that sculpture, for example, the little 14-year-old dancer by Edgar Degas, which we had just seen in the previous slide, one of 69 sculptures by Degas in this bequest. Next, I want to take a closer look at an object by Degas and one by Cassatt, both included in the Havemeyer bequest and in Making the Met. So this work by Degas, Woman Having Her Hair Combed from 1886 to 1888, is one of the vibrant pastels in the Havemeyer collection. And it is an important one to point out because these nudes, bathers by Degas, were considered transgressive at the time that they were debuted in the final Impressionist exhibition of 1886. The way that they revealed women in these intimate moments, not looking as glamorous as the idealized and often mythologized nudes of academic art of the time. Degas was taking this closer look. Some have attributed it to his misogynism. However, others see it as a more naturalistic view of women. Vibrant colors here also contribute to its bold presentation. On the right, Mary Cassatt's Mother and Child, the Oval Mirror from around 1899, is also a view of a toilette scene, here of a mother and child. And Cassatt was known for her much more naturalistic, tender representations of mothers with their children, drawing on the historical Madonna and Child subject matter, but bringing it into the home, into the present moment here. So both of these views are very intimate scenes, and both beautifully rendered, colorfully depicted, and also using these interesting viewpoints, that oval mirror that frames the child and some of the mother's head in the Cassatt, that diagonal view of the chaise in the Degas. Both of them were interested in types of cropping that would bring new views to their pictures. So it was, as I mentioned, Cassatt who introduced Louisine Havemeyer to Impressionism in the 1870s, right at the height of this movement as it was happening. And that's what allowed Louisine to go, as a later critic once said, a hot-headed, flouting conventions by going hot-headed for El Greco and the Impressionists. A. Havemeyer, a later curator at the Met, wrote about the Havemeyers in this way, showing how their tastes diverged from other other collectors of their time in these earlier moments of the museum's history. So subject matter was one of the important ways that these works were distinguished as avant-garde in their time. And this next pairing I'm showing brings that to the fore through two nudes by Edouard Manet, The Dead Christ with Angels of 1864, and Gustave Courbet's Woman with a Parrot of 1866. And I pair these two together because both were seen as very bold pictures in their time for an unidealized depiction of the nude, similar to that Bather by Degas. And both were acquired by the Havemeyers, in fact, with the museum in mind. Both also were lent to the Met in 1909, so a seed of what was to come from the Havemeyer collection. These were no longer such shocking pictures by the time that they were revealed at the Met, but that history of shocking contemporary viewers is still very important to these two works of art. And again, the fact that the Havemeyers were thinking about the public and about the museum in decades before their bequest in 1929, I think is key here. As we move on to the works of Claude Monet, perhaps the quintessential Impressionist, I think that it's helpful to have some context here that the Met had primarily acquired works of art that had been sanctioned by, welcomed into the canon of art history, sanctioned by other museums. And in fact, it was in 1929, the Louvre accessioned works of Impressionist art. So there was a call by this time for Impressionism at the Met. In fact, the critic Walter Pock had published a book in 1928 all about criticizing the Met for not recognizing Impressionism and modern French art in its collection. But you can see that it took the Met some 50 years to acknowledge and to accept and to then ultimately display with great fanfare, great appreciation, these works of art that had been so daring in their day. And I think that's something that you'll see when Randy and Doug talk about the collections of other types of modern art, including photographs. So the works I'm showing here by Monet, La Grenouillère on the left is a work from 1869 included in Making the Met. And this one I chose because it is a work that has been identified as a turning point in Impressionism. The first Impressionist exhibition took place in 1874, but here in the late 1860s, you can see Monet's interest in scenes of Parisian leisure and scenes of modern life, as well as his broad brushwork, his interest in depicting the effects of light, as you can see on the water here in this, this bathing place outside of Paris. I'm also showing work that is not in Making the Met, but was part of the Havemeyer bequest, The Bridge Over a Pond of Water Lilies from 1899, one of the most famous works of art in the Havemeyer collection, in the Met's collection. In fact, at times, the most searched work of art on the Met's web collection website. So here you can see the range of works by Monet, that quintessential Impressionist, whose style is what made his art so modern, in addition to subject matter. The Havemeyers gave 8 Monets to the museum in their bequest. And finally, this work by Paul Cézanne, Mont Sainte-Victoire and the Viaduct of the Arc River Valley from 1882 to 1885. This is about as modern as the Havemeyer collection would get. Cézanne was the only post-Impressionist artist who got their attention. They were introduced to him as well by Mary Cassatt, but Cézanne was included in the in some of the Impressionist exhibitions, then later recognized as one of these forefathers of modern art by other artists that you will hear about later. So his approach to the landscape, his interest in geometries, he said that he wanted to bring to Impressionism a more fixed geometry, a more fixed kind of composition to expand on and to update the Impressionist style. Mont Sainte-Victoire is a subject that he studied in many compositions, and the Havemeyers introduced the first of this important series galleries into the Met's collection in 1929. So altogether, what this collection demonstrates is that it was through the visions of these collectors who were introduced to Impressionism by an American artist that they were able to acquire in a bold way for their own enjoyment, but in fact, with the museum in mind, and that once this art had received more broad approval, it was welcomed into the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. We show it in the Making the Met galleries, as you can see here, in ways that you don't just see it in our 19th century French galleries typically. So for example, the Cézanne and the Monet flank a case of Tiffany's Favril glass, itself a type of avant-garde art that the Havemeyers introduced into the collection. And finally, I show this view here as a segue into Reckoning with Modernism to show the way that these works of art lead from one to the next, from that 1866 Woman with a Parrot by Courbet, glimpsing back at the Degas 1886 to 88 Bather, and leading us into this section, Reckoning with Modernism, where I will now turn it over to Randy Griffey to talk to you about some of the other key players in this moment.
Thank you, Laura, and hello to everyone tuning in, and very happy to participate in this kind of deep dive into this section of Making the Met and this important kind of turning point of 1929, because as Laura and Doug and I have spoken about throughout this process, is that this is a kind of flashpoint in not only American history, but also in the institution's history. And there's a lot of relationship between those two overlapping histories around this year of 1929. So as Laura, of course, laid out so beautifully, 1929 was the year of the great grand Havemeyer gift. The same year, and this is where 1929 serves as a kind of touchstone very much for me and the part of the collection that I really tend to, which is the early 20th century. The same year, the Met declines the gift of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's collection of mostly works by living American artists, a turn down that famously precipitated, of course, the founding and subsequent opening of the museum that bears her name. The reasons for the decline are very complicated, can't get into all of them here, but of course, as you know well by this point, the museum leadership was at best ambivalent about contemporary art throughout the early 20th century, both European, which was often deemed to be too cutting edge and indecipherable, and also American contemporary art of the early 20th century, which is often perceived to be inadequate aesthetically. Also, the museum already had two endowed funds designated for 20th century American art, which it was beholden to use, but in many instances didn't really care too much to make use of those funds. So in some cases, they had acquired works of art that did overlap to some extent with Gertrude Vanderbilt's collecting interests. So maybe that's another reason it wasn't perceived to be desirable for the Met's collection. Also too, in 1929, the Whitney collection didn't quite hold yet some of the very great works we think of today, such as Edward Hopper's Early Sunday Morning. I would like to think that if Early Sunday Morning were on offer in 1929, the Met would have maybe reconsidered. So in addition to turning down the Whitney gift, throughout the early 20th century, as many tuning in will also know, the Met did regrettably neglect many talented Black artists of the early 20th century, with a few exceptions, but generally the Met regrettably missed the great Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s. So that became a great lacuna in the Met's collection. And what we'll look at here is a great work now in the Met's collection by Aaron Douglas, the towering figure of the Harlem Renaissance. This is a great example of Douglas's flat graphic style, which he honed by doing graphic work for really early important Black publications such as Crisis and Opportunity. The Met's work is called Let My People Go. The subject is related to the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, while the title itself is drawn from a lyric from Go Down Moses, which is a traditional spiritual from the 19th century through the 20th. Douglas here in this great, slick, flat style shows Moses succumbing to God's command to lead the Israelites out of enslavement in Egypt, a story that the artist adopted as an allegory paralleling the conditions of enslaved Black Americans. In fact, Go Down Moses is a song popular with enslaved people throughout the 19th century, but also in the 20th century among civil rights activists. The picture is part of God's Trombones, which is a series Douglas executed throughout the mid-1930s. And the Met's the Met's example is number 7 of a group of 8 related works. So we're very lucky to have added this later in the Met's collection. We acquired it in 2015, which is part of an ongoing effort to retroactively address the Harlem Renaissance, which is not an easy task to do from so many years later. But on that note, I do want to show you also another acquisition from 2015. Again, part of this effort to shore up the collection of works by Black artists in the early 20th century and really expand the storyline of the Harlem Renaissance. This is Hale Woodruff's Card Players, which was the culmination of his 4 years of work and study and living in Europe, specifically in Paris, where, as you might detect from seeing this image, he's looking at Cézanne, he's looking at African sculpture, but also painting in a way that evokes a kind of wood carving technique, even woodcut printmaking. This is a work that Woodruff completed with the support of the Harman Foundation, which played an important role in the Harlem Renaissance for supporting aspiring young Black artists. And this is, in a way, the culmination of Woodruff's 4 years in Paris, underwritten by the Harman Foundation. So it also helps to make the point that the Harlem Renaissance was in fact an international phenomenon, not fixed solely to the neighborhood we know north of Central Park. So while the Met was, putting it lightly, uneasy with most modern painting and sculpture from this period, and did neglect important contemporaneous movements such as the Harlem Renaissance, it did excel in other areas, and specifically in the area of modern design. And here I'm very much indebted to the work and research and writing of my former colleague, Marilyn Friedman, who contributed to this part of the essay that you may know from the catalog accompanying Making the Met. So the Met throughout the early 20th century actually had quite a forward-thinking and ambitious program of exhibitions of industrial arts, primarily meant to inspire American designers and manufacturers. In fact, one of the museum's major exhibitions of industrial arts took place in 1929, and it's a show that attracted over 186,000 visitors, a number that we would be very happy with even today by comparison. And this chair we're looking at by Eliel Saarinen appeared in this 1929 exhibition, and it appears in Making the Met. It's a tallback chair, presumably for a dining set, but stylistically, with regard to materials, it speaks to Saarinen's retention of natural materials in much of his work, but the spare, unornamented design registers as distinctly modern and in subtle dialogue with even more streamlined styles that predominated through the 1920s across media. In recent years, the Met has been able to acquire key examples of industrial arts that it had exhibited in the 1920s and the 1930s, but did not acquire at the time. A great gift from John Waddell, one work from which we're looking at here, the dusky table lamp. A great gift from John Waddell included several key works along these lines. So the Met has been able to retroactively, years later, bring into the collection things that it had shown in design exhibitions, but did not acquire at the time. So this dusky lamp is a signature design from 1927, and the lamp demonstrates the language of geometric abstraction applied to functional design and the popularity of sleek machine-age aesthetics of the period. And here is an image where you see both objects installed beautifully in Making the Met in the section Reckoning with Modernism. Some of Deskey's slick, streamlined style can be seen in this work, one of the icons of the Met's collection of American modernism, Charles Demas, I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold. This is a great example of from the period what would be described, I think, today as precisionism, which is a slick, streamlined style, which was harmonious with and drawn from the machine age aesthetics of the period, and to some extent in constant dialogue with contemporary photography. Dima's painting is a visual interpretation of a poem by William Carlos Williams, describing the clanging sound of a fire truck alarm going down the street. Repetition of the number 5, which is the number of the fire truck, is meant to evoke the alarm's reverberations as throughout the deep urban canyon of the street. It's a celebration of the raucous modern metropolis, but it's also a symbolic portrait of the author Williams, whose initials Dima has inserted in the composition itself. Dima's rather optimistic view of industrial modernity carries over to some extent in the largest panel in Thomas Hart Benton's America Today mural. Now, it's not in Making the Met because we can't move it. It's too big and we needed the space. But it's one of the, I think, attractions of the Wallace Wing featured on the first floor. But it's also one of the truly transformational acquisitions of recent years from the collection as a gift from AXA Equitable. And it's a great time capsule for the moment that we're focused on in this program. And in this view, we're looking at the mural's largest panel, Instruments of Power, which is an unabashed exaltation of America's industrial progress from the 19th century to the 20th. But as this time capsule by Benton, as America Today reveals, its boundless optimism would quickly begin to seem a bit nostalgic over subsequent years. Benton received the commission for this mural for the boardroom at the new School for Social Research, a new building that they'd commissioned from Joseph Urban. Benton's mural originally sat in the boardroom. But he received the commission in the spring of 1930, which of course was weeks after the Wall Street crash of 1929, which of course, as Laura mentioned, precipitated the Great Depression throughout the next decade. And Benton recalled his gradual realization over the 9-month duration and execution of his mural. And just an interesting and great side note here is that the young Jackson Pollock, who was his student, was his studio assistant on this project. But it's over that course of 9 months, Benton recalled, as did his generation, gradual recognition that their circumstances went well and beyond just a single crash, as that crash was followed by subsequent crashes, which made it clear as we moved into 1930 that this economic disaster was going to be a prolonged and difficult and painful ordeal. So that the circumstances of the jazz age and the industrial age of the 1920s were really forever changed. The mural concludes with this overdoor panel he added as a kind of coda to the project. It was not in the original design, interestingly. By most accounts, this is the first painted reference to breadlines that increasingly populated American streets in New York, but well and beyond across the country. And on the right, Benton indicts plurocrats like J.P. Morgan for what he believed to be was their role in creating circumstances leading to the crash. Now, no view of 1929 would be complete without this other institutional player who came into the ecosystem of New York's art world of this period. Like the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Modern Art also came online in 1929, was founded that year. And among many other effects, MoMA's opening generally bolstered the Met's inclination to steer clear of modern art, to see itself as a museum of so-called classic art that had stood the test of time. And of course, that situation has changed dramatically over time as well, especially with the opening of the Lila Atchison Wallace Wing for Modern and Contemporary Art in 1987. But that, of course, is a story for another day. And now our colleague, Doug Eklund, will pick up another part of this important storyline around the museum's history around this moment. Take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Randy. You can see here a detail of the wall that shows part of the Department of Photographs representation in making the Met. The six photographs at left are all from the moment in around between 1929 and 1933. But when photography first entered the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, actually the year before in 1928. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see the image by a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz of his then mistress and the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. This is Georgia O'Keeffe torso of 1918. This is one of the first photographs to enter the Metropolitan Museum as a work of art in 1928 through a very clever ruse by Stieglitz, working in cahoots with the print curator, William Ivins, to seed the print department collection with this radical new photography by Stieglitz giving his photographs to some of his prominent supporters, such as Alma Wertheim, wife of investment banker Maurice Wertheim, and having these donors sort of make an offer that couldn't be refused to the Met. And Stieglitz announced in 1928 to his friend at the MFA Boston, who was the second museum to collect photographs at works of art, he said, the Metropolitan Museum has opened its halls to photography, and my photographs have done the trick. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see one of the early works that was collected by Stieglitz in his role as a kind of dealer and advocate for photography going all the way back to the turn of the century. This is a very different photograph depiction of womanhood, as it were, by an artist that he championed, Gertrude Casimir, and its title is Blessed Art Thou Among Women. This is the kind of material that Stieglitz advocated for. It should also be noted that in photography, because of its role as a quote unquote peripheral medium in the hierarchy of mediums, women were able to enter as valid artists in a way that maybe they weren't as much in painting and sculpture. But this shows a very different depiction than the brazen portrait of O'Keeffe's torso. This very gentle, gauzy, dreamy, private image of a domestic interior and a sort of sacrosanct bourgeois space. And these were photographs that were collected by Alfred Stieglitz, advocated for, placed in collections, and then he had this enormous collection of 400 photographs of this kind. And by 1933, 4 years after 29, he really wanted to unburden himself of this photography that he personally in his own work and photography in general had moved way beyond. In slide 28, you can see this radical image by one of his sort of artist avatars that named Paul Strand, who he featured prominently in his journal camera work. This is the 1916 image called Blind Woman New York by Strand. And Stieglitz closed his representation of photography in camera work in 1916 with a single issue devoted to Paul Strand, and wrote that there was nothing more interesting in photography to be covered. And then the journal went on to cover cubism and anything but photography. So here you can see photography moving out into the streets using a small camera rather than a large view camera with its granular detail. This is an image shot on the fly and presaging bringing a whole new kind of documentary, verite, gritty, in your face, socially oriented photography that was nonetheless inflected with Cubist ideas of text and image into photography. And this is the kind of work that would go on and really be taken up by photographers who saw Alfred Stieglitz as the enemy. In the following slide, you can see an image not in Making the Met, but I wanted to show it because it's a negative by Walker Evans that he made in 1929 as a young man fresh from Paris who had imbibed Cubism and written like James Joyce. And he detested Alfred Stieglitz and wanted to make work that flew in the face of Stieglitz's, what he saw as Stieglitz's arty pretensions, and make work that was more kind of like a personal confessional poem crossed with social critique. And this is a work that was made right after the stock market crash. So you can see through this constellation of 4 works, radically different views of photography around 1929, collected by the Met, and also the limitations of what Stieglitz's view of photography were at the time that would be picked up by other younger artists. And now back to Laura Corey for some concluding remarks about our presentation.
Thanks, Doug and Randy, for offering us these deep insights into the collections of modern paintings, sculpture, decorative arts, and photographs. And that concludes what we are going to say today about this 1929 moment. But I wanted to point out here that this is not the end of the story of modern or even modern and contemporary art in making the Met. There are 2 major other modern moments, if you will, in the exhibition. One you see here in a section, a subsection, if you will, of our gallery, the Centennial Era. This gallery looks at the establishment of the Department of Contemporary Arts in 1967 under curator Henry Geldzahler, his pivotal exhibition, New York Painting and Sculpture, 1940 to 1970. It looks at the ways that Geldzahler both established a canon and brought contemporary art into the museum, but also some of his blind spots, particularly for artists who were not white American or European men. In our final gallery, Broadening Perspectives, which looks at the period from the 1990s to the present, we look at the Met's broad engagement with contemporary art from all over the world. For example, you can see glimpses in this image of that great grand finale of the exhibition, El Anatsui's Dusasa II from 2007, acquired from the Venice Biennale of that year by the Metropolitan Museum, and also ways that the collection of earlier modern art, for example, you get a glimpse of Carmen Herrera's painting Iberic from 1949, that abstract red, orange, and black painting at the left by a Cuban-American woman artist, recognized later in her lifetime. And we also, in the Reckoning with Modernism gallery, look at the Leonard Lauder collection of gifts and promised gifts of Cubist art. So looking back to an area of modernism the Met had overlooked in the earlier years of its history. We hope that you will be able to visit the exhibition on view until January 3rd. But even if not, we encourage you to explore the many digital resources available on the exhibition website, perhaps to get a copy of the catalog and to explore more of the many stories embedded in this exhibition. I wish to thank again my many, many colleagues who have contributed to this show, and particularly today to Mariana, Randy, and Doug, and to all of you for tuning in. Thank you.